In the winter of 1943, while the world believed American bombers were only flying missions of fire and steel, a second war was unfolding inside sealed hangars guarded by armed military police. Engineers were secretly mounting heavy naval cannons into bomber airframes. When those aircraft finally entered combat, the sky itself became a battlefield, and entire enemy formations were erased without warning. Official United States Army Air Forces archives contain no direct reference to a program called Project Iron Talon, yet within declassified maintenance ledgers and shipping manifests there exists a pattern that cannot be dismissed. In late 1942, shortly after American bomber formations began suffering catastrophic losses against German air defenses, a classified directive was issued to several aircraft modification facilities in both the United States and Great Britain. These facilities were instructed to prepare reinforced fuselages, strengthened wing spars, and experimental weapon mounts not designed for bombs, but for large-caliber direct-fire cannons. The idea was revolutionary and deeply controversial. Bombers had always been designed as high-altitude siege weapons, dropping explosive payloads over wide areas. Project Iron Talon instead proposed turning bombers into airborne artillery platforms capable of firing horizontally into enemy targets. Engineers quickly discovered that such a conversion would require far more than simply bolting a cannon into an aircraft. The recoil forces alone were powerful enough to twist the metal structure of a bomber apart. Entire nose sections had to be rebuilt with heavy steel bracing, and internal frames were redesigned to distribute firing stress across the airframe. Specialized shock absorption systems were installed to prevent the cannon from tearing loose when fired. Crews of machinists and aeronautical engineers worked in total secrecy under constant military guard, many of them unaware of the full purpose of the modifications they were making. They were told only that this weapon might decide the future of the air war. Outside the guarded hangars, bomber crews continued to fly conventional missions over Europe, facing flak and enemy fighters with no knowledge that a new and terrifying form of aerial warfare was being prepared behind locked steel doors. By the beginning of 1943, the first prototype aircraft of Project Iron Talon was rolled out under the cover of darkness at an isolated airfield in the English countryside. From the outside it appeared to be an ordinary heavy bomber, but inside its reinforced nose section sat a modified naval cannon capable of firing shells heavier than most aerial bombs. The weapon was mounted along the center line of the aircraft, replacing the bombardier compartment and forcing a complete redesign of the forward crew stations. The bombardier was removed entirely and replaced with a specialized gunnery officer trained to operate the cannon using optical sights and range calculation tables adapted from naval warfare. Ammunition was stored in armored compartments that stretched through the forward fuselage, feeding the cannon through a mechanized loading system designed to function under intense vibration and combat stress. Engineers were uncertain whether such a system could operate reliably at high altitude where cold temperatures and low air pressure could cause metal parts to seize. For weeks the prototype remained grounded while technicians fired the cannon in static tests, measuring structural strain with gauges attached throughout the aircraft. Each time the cannon fired, the entire bomber shuddered as if struck by a giant fist, yet the airframe held. When test pilots finally took the aircraft into the air, they were ordered to fire only a single round at a time. Even so, the recoil was powerful enough to slow the aircraft in midair, momentarily robbing it of forward momentum. Despite this, the tests proved that the concept was viable. The cannon could accurately hit a target at distances far beyond the reach of machine guns, turning the bomber into a long-range sniper in the sky. Military planners immediately recognized the potential. Instead of flying into deadly anti-aircraft fire to drop bombs, these modified bombers could destroy enemy flak batteries, radar stations, and even fortified bunkers from a distance. The danger, however, was that if the enemy learned of this new weapon, they would prioritize its destruction. For that reason, only a handful of air crews were selected for training, and each man was required to sign secrecy oaths that carried the penalty of imprisonment or worse. They were told that their mission was so classified that even fellow pilots were not to know what they were flying. As they trained in isolated airspace over the Atlantic, firing at remote targets to calibrate their weapons, the pilots began to understand that they were no longer simply bomber crews. They were becoming something entirely new, the operators of the most heavily armed aircraft ever to take to the skies. By mid-1943, intelligence reports from occupied Europe showed that German air defenses were becoming increasingly lethal, with improved radar networks and heavier anti-aircraft guns decimating American bomber formations before they could reach their targets. It was this crisis that finally pushed Project Iron Talon from the shadows into limited operational use. A small detachment of modified bombers was quietly assigned to a classified air group operating from a remote airbase in eastern England. Their mission was not to bomb cities, but to surgically dismantle the defensive systems that protected them. The first combat deployment took place against a heavily fortified radar installation on the French coast that was guiding German fighters toward Allied bombers. Instead of approaching in a tight formation, the Iron Talon aircraft flew at medium altitude, well outside the range of most anti-aircraft guns. Using precision range-finding equipment adapted from naval fire control systems, the gunnery officers calculated firing solutions as though they were aboard a battleship aiming at an enemy cruiser. When the lead aircraft fired, the shell traveled miles through open air before slamming directly into the radar station, destroying it in a single strike. Observers on the ground reported no warning, no incoming bombers, only a sudden explosion that seemed to come from nowhere. German defenders were stunned, unable to understand how their installations were being destroyed without any aircraft appearing overhead. Over the following weeks, Iron Talon bombers repeated this pattern, picking off command bunkers, anti-aircraft batteries, and communications hubs with terrifying accuracy. Each successful mission made the skies safer for conventional bomber groups, which now faced fewer guns and less organized fighter interception. The crews of the Iron Talon aircraft began to feel the psychological weight of their role. They were not engaging enemy pilots in dramatic dogfights, nor were they dropping thousands of bombs in visible destruction. Instead, they were erasing key pieces of the enemy war machine in near silence, leaving behind confusion and broken defenses. German intelligence struggled to identify the source of these attacks, often blaming sabotage or long-range artillery rather than aircraft. The secrecy of the program was holding, but the danger was growing. Every mission increased the risk that one of these aircraft would be seen, shot down, or captured. If even a single Iron Talon bomber fell intact into enemy hands, the strategic advantage it provided could be lost. For that reason, the crews were instructed that if their aircraft were crippled, they were to destroy it at all costs before it could be recovered. They flew knowing that they carried not only a powerful weapon, but also a secret so dangerous that their own survival was considered secondary to its protection. As the summer of 1943 progressed, the impact of Project Iron Talon began to quietly reshape the air war over Europe. Conventional bomber losses dropped noticeably in sectors where the modified cannon aircraft had been active, though the reason for this change was never publicly acknowledged. German anti-aircraft crews reported unexplained failures of their forward batteries and command bunkers, often destroyed hours before major Allied bombing raids arrived. This created gaps in the defensive network that could not be repaired quickly enough, allowing American and British bombers to pass through with reduced resistance. Behind the scenes, Iron Talon crews were flying nearly non-stop, striking targets that had been identified through aerial reconnaissance and resistance networks on the ground. Their aircraft were treated as irreplaceable assets, maintained by hand-picked technicians who were flown in under false identities. Even among high-ranking officers, few knew the true nature of the missions being conducted. The stress on the crews was immense. Unlike standard bomber operations, which relied on numbers for survival, these aircraft often flew alone or in pairs, depending entirely on speed, stealth, and their massive forward cannon to stay alive. German fighter patrols were beginning to notice strange aircraft that fired powerful bursts of light from their noses, followed by explosions on the ground far below. Rumors spread through the Luftwaffe that the Americans had developed some kind of flying siege gun. In response, German commanders ordered more aggressive interception tactics, sending fighter groups to hunt these mysterious bombers. The Iron Talon pilots were forced to engage in running battles through the clouds, sometimes firing their cannon at approaching fighters with devastating effect. A direct hit from one of the heavy shells could tear a fighter aircraft apart instantly, but the slow firing rate and limited ammunition meant that every shot had to count. Several aircraft were lost during these encounters, vanishing over enemy territory with no survivors. Each loss was recorded only in classified reports, their crews officially listed as missing on conventional bombing missions. Despite the danger, the program continued because its results were undeniable. Enemy radar coverage was collapsing, flak corridors were opening, and Allied bombing accuracy was improving. Yet the secrecy surrounding Iron Talon meant that its successes could not be celebrated, only quietly exploited. The men who flew these missions returned to base knowing that their contribution would never be acknowledged in public, even if it shortened the war by months or years. They were ghosts in their own military, fighting a hidden war within the larger conflict, and the burden of that knowledge weighed heavily on every flight they took. By early 1944, Project Iron Talon had expanded from a small experimental unit into a fully operational but still deeply classified strike force. New bombers were being converted at an accelerated pace, each one incorporating lessons learned from the losses and successes of earlier missions. The cannons were improved with more reliable feeding mechanisms, reinforced barrels, and better recoil dampening systems that allowed faster follow-up shots without compromising aircraft stability. Crews were trained not only in aerial gunnery but also in the principles of artillery warfare, learning how to calculate wind drift, altitude effects, and target movement with the precision of ground-based fire control officers. This made Iron Talon aircraft uniquely capable of engaging both fixed and moving targets, including armored columns and naval vessels operating near the coast. One of the most significant missions of the program occurred during preparations for the Allied invasion of Western Europe. German coastal defenses were dense and well organized, with concrete bunkers, heavy guns, and command posts designed to repel any amphibious assault. In the weeks leading up to the landings, Iron Talon bombers were dispatched to silently dismantle these defenses one by one. Flying at night or through cloud cover, they would fire long-range cannon rounds into key positions, destroying artillery emplacements and observation posts without revealing their presence. Ground resistance fighters later confirmed that entire German gun crews were killed without ever hearing an aircraft overhead. This silent neutralization of coastal defenses saved countless Allied lives when the invasion finally began. However, the increasing importance of Iron Talon also made it a high-priority target for the enemy. German intelligence had pieced together enough fragments to conclude that some form of heavy armed bomber was operating behind the front lines. Fighter squadrons were ordered to search relentlessly for these aircraft, leading to some of the most intense aerial engagements of the war. Iron Talon crews now faced not only flak but determined interception by experienced enemy pilots. Their heavily modified bombers were slower and less maneuverable than standard models, making them vulnerable if caught. To survive, crews relied on their cannon as both a weapon and a deterrent. More than once, pursuing fighters were destroyed by a single devastating shot, scattering the rest of the enemy formation. Despite these victories, every mission carried the risk of capture or destruction. The men who flew Iron Talon aircraft knew that they were riding a machine that was as dangerous to them as it was to the enemy, yet they continued to fly because they could see the war shifting in their favor with every secret strike they delivered. As the war moved deeper into 1944, the operational tempo of Project Iron Talon reached its peak. Allied forces were advancing across France, and the demand for precise destruction of enemy strongpoints was greater than ever. Iron Talon aircraft were now tasked with supporting ground offensives by eliminating fortified positions that had resisted conventional bombing and artillery. From high altitude and beyond the reach of most German guns, these flying artillery platforms could punch holes through concrete bunkers and command centers that had survived weeks of shelling. The psychological impact on German troops was severe. Survivors described explosions that came without warning, as if the sky itself had turned against them. Without the sound of approaching aircraft, there was no time to take cover. Morale in certain sectors collapsed as units abandoned positions that they believed were cursed or under some form of invisible attack. Meanwhile, the strain on Iron Talon crews was growing unbearable. They were flying more frequently, often multiple missions in a single week, with little rest and even less recognition. Casualties were quietly mounting, and replacements were difficult to train due to the complexity of the aircraft and the secrecy of the program. Each crewman had to master not only flight operations but also the intricacies of the massive cannon, its targeting systems, and its maintenance. One mistake could doom an entire mission. Despite this, their effectiveness could not be denied. During one particularly critical battle in the autumn of 1944, Iron Talon bombers destroyed a series of German armored concentrations that were preparing a counterattack. The shells fired from the aircraft penetrated tank armor and detonated ammunition stores, turning entire columns into burning wreckage before they could reach the front. Ground commanders credited these strikes with preventing a breakthrough that might have delayed the Allied advance for weeks. Yet all official reports attributed the destruction to conventional airstrikes or artillery, preserving the secrecy of Iron Talon. For the men involved, this erasure was a bitter price to pay. They watched the war being won with the help of their efforts, yet their role remained invisible. Still, they continued to fly, driven by a sense of duty and the knowledge that every successful mission brought the end of the conflict closer. In the shadows of history, Project Iron Talon was quietly shaping the outcome of the largest war the world had ever known. By the beginning of 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing under the combined pressure of Allied armies from the West and Soviet forces from the East, yet pockets of fierce resistance remained. Project Iron Talon was now directed toward these final strongholds, where German command centers and underground fortifications continued to coordinate desperate countermeasures. These targets were often buried deep beneath reinforced concrete and earth, making them nearly immune to standard bombing. The heavy cannon carried by Iron Talon aircraft, however, could fire armor-piercing shells designed to penetrate deep into such structures before exploding. In several documented missions, a single well-placed shot collapsed entire underground bunkers, killing command staffs and severing communications in an instant. The effectiveness of these strikes further hastened the disintegration of organized German resistance. At the same time, the danger to Iron Talon crews increased as the enemy became more desperate. German fighters and remaining anti-aircraft units were ordered to concentrate all available fire on any aircraft suspected of carrying the mysterious cannon. Some Iron Talon bombers were damaged so badly that they barely managed to limp back to base, riddled with holes and leaking fuel. Others did not return at all, vanishing into the chaos of the final months of the war. Each loss was a reminder that even the most advanced weapon could not guarantee survival in the skies over Europe. Despite this, the program continued to deliver results. One of the last major operations involved the destruction of a fortified mountain headquarters that intelligence believed was coordinating a planned evacuation of high-ranking German officials. Iron Talon aircraft fired from miles away, collapsing the entrance tunnels and sealing the bunker with those inside. When Allied troops later arrived, they found only crushed concrete and silence. As victory drew closer, the question of what would happen to Project Iron Talon loomed over everyone involved. The weapon had proven its value, but it was also a reminder of how far warfare had been pushed in the pursuit of victory. The crews knew that once peace came, their aircraft would likely be dismantled and their missions erased from the public record. They had become instruments of a war that was about to end, leaving them with memories that could never be fully shared. In the closing weeks of the European War, Project Iron Talon was quietly withdrawn from frontline operations. With German defenses in disarray and Allied forces racing toward Berlin, the need for such a specialized and risky weapon was diminishing. Orders were issued for all Iron Talon aircraft to return to secure airfields in Britain, where they were to be inspected, documented, and prepared for deactivation. For the crews, this marked the end of a chapter that had defined their wartime experience. They had flown some of the most dangerous and secret missions of the conflict, yet now they were instructed to remain silent and blend back into the ranks of ordinary airmen. The aircraft themselves were stripped of their cannons, the massive weapons removed under heavy guard and transported to unknown storage facilities. Engineers carefully recorded every modification, every structural change, as if preparing for a future that might one day require such machines again. At the same time, intelligence officers gathered the pilots and gunnery crews for debriefings that lasted days. They were questioned about every mission, every malfunction, every enemy encounter, not for public recognition but to ensure that no detail of the program was lost within classified archives. Many of the men found this process strangely hollow. They had risked their lives repeatedly, yet there would be no medals, no parades, and no official acknowledgement of what they had done. Their families would never know why they had been gone for so long or why some of their comrades never returned. As the war in Europe officially ended, celebrations erupted across Allied nations, but within the Iron Talon units, there was a quieter mood. They had helped break the enemy, but at the cost of becoming invisible participants in history. The secrecy that had protected their mission now ensured that it would fade into obscurity. Still, among themselves, they knew the truth. They had flown the most heavily armed bombers ever built, turning aircraft into flying siege guns, and in doing so they had rewritten the rules of air warfare, even if no one outside their small circle would ever be told. After the war in Europe ended, Project Iron Talon did not simply disappear, it was deliberately buried. The remaining aircraft were either returned to standard bomber configuration or dismantled entirely, their reinforced sections cut apart and melted down so that no physical trace of the program would remain. The cannons themselves were shipped to secure storage, catalogued under vague designations that concealed their true purpose. Officially, Iron Talon never existed. The men who had flown its missions were reassigned to other units or sent home, instructed never to speak of what they had done. For many of them, this sudden silence was harder to bear than the dangers of combat. They had lived for months under constant threat, operating a weapon that could change the course of battles, and now they were expected to pretend it had all been ordinary. Some wrote letters that they never sent, trying to explain to loved ones what they had experienced, only to tear them up out of fear of violating their oaths. Within military research circles, however, the lessons of Iron Talon were quietly studied. Engineers and strategists recognized that the concept of mounting heavy direct-fire weapons on aircraft had enormous potential. Although the specific technology of the Second World War limited what could be achieved, the idea of a flying gun platform capable of precision strikes would influence future designs for decades to come. In this way, Iron Talon lived on, not in public memory but in the blueprints of later aircraft and the doctrines of air power that emerged during the Cold War. For the veterans of the program, this knowledge offered some measure of comfort. They could see traces of their work in the evolution of military aviation, even if their own names were never attached to it. As years passed, some of the classified documents were slowly declassified, revealing fragments of the truth to historians. These scattered references, maintenance records, and mission logs allowed researchers to piece together a shadowy outline of what had once been a revolutionary and dangerous experiment. Project Iron Talon had been a product of desperation and innovation, born in the darkest days of the war and hidden away when the light of peace returned. It remained one of the many secrets that shaped the outcome of the conflict without ever becoming part of its official story. In the decades that followed the Second World War, the story of Project Iron Talon remained largely unknown outside a small circle of military historians and archivists who specialized in classified weapons programs. What little information survived existed in scattered documents that only hinted at the true scope of the project. Yet when these fragments were assembled, a picture emerged of one of the most daring and unconventional experiments in the history of aerial warfare. The decision to mount heavy cannons on bombers had not been driven by curiosity alone, but by the brutal realities of a war in which conventional tactics were failing against hardened defenses. Iron Talon was a response to that crisis, a fusion of naval firepower and air mobility that allowed Allied forces to strike with unprecedented precision and power. Its success demonstrated that aircraft could be more than carriers of bombs or machine guns. They could become platforms for artillery capable of shaping the battlefield far beyond the front lines. Although the program was dismantled, its influence endured. Many of the principles developed during Iron Talon were later applied to post-war aircraft designs, particularly those intended for ground attack and close air support. The idea that an aircraft could carry a weapon powerful enough to destroy armored targets with direct fire would become a cornerstone of modern air power. For the men who flew and maintained these machines, the legacy of Iron Talon was deeply personal. They had been part of a secret war within a war, risking everything to give their side an edge when it was needed most. Even as their deeds faded from public memory, they knew that their work had helped bring the conflict to an end sooner and with fewer Allied casualties. In this way, Project Iron Talon fulfilled its purpose, not as a legend celebrated in books and films, but as a silent force that altered the course of history from behind closed doors. It stands as a reminder that some of the most important chapters of war are written not in the headlines, but in the classified files that only later generations may uncover.